We have prisons to keep real-life villains at bay, but no system is unbreachable, and sometimes the nightmares slip through the cracks. Join us on our first Jail Marathon, a compilation of some of the craziest prison escape stories ever. From intricate plans of escape to lucky twists of fate, these stories have all the ingredients to leave you speechless. Think some of these sound impossible? Guess again. Welcome to Jail. In 1971, Frank Abagnale was being escorted to the Federal Detention Center in Atlanta, Georgia. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison for forging checks. It seemed like a simple procedure that had been done several times before. But what was different about this transfer was that a small bureaucratic error meant that Frank had the perfect opportunity to plan his escape. Because what prison guards didn't know about Frank was that he wasn't just an ordinary check forger, but one of the greatest con men that they would ever meet. Frank Abagnale started his career in crime at an early age. It all started out with the divorce of his parents when he was only 14 years old. He ran out of the courtroom when asked to choose whom he wanted to live with, and soon after committed his first crime. From the separation of his parents to his first encounter with criminal life, he dealt with life's cards in a less than ideal way. His father, who he loved and respected a lot, was one of the first targets of his harmful impulses. Frank found a way to use his father's card to buy tires and batteries from gas stations, and then asked the attendants for the cash in return for those products. He made a whopping $3,400 defrauding his father, and this turned out to be just the beginning. Frank soon started building a reputation for himself as a career criminal, starting impersonating people at the age of 15. Early on, his exploits were as simple as forging checks and petty theft, but by the age of 21, he was one of the world's most wanted criminals. He had already impersonated a teacher, a doctor, and even a pilot. He had even broken parole on several occasions, and one time he did so by stealing a car. Run-ins with the law were nothing new for Frank. However, this time around was different. He felt like it was his time to shine while being escorted to prison by a U.S. Marshal. In his line of business, this must have been a real Hall of Fame moment. But things were about to get even better for Frank. The U.S. Marshal escorting him had forgotten to give the prison Abagnale's detention commitment. This is highly unusual for the procedure in question. Unable to find a better explanation for what they didn't realize was a major bureaucratic error, the prison guards jumped to the conclusion that they were being investigated by Frank, who they were sure was an undercover FBI inspector. The guards played right into Frank's hands, and Frank immediately started planning his escape. He was a natural at getting into people's minds through sheer confidence. Back when he was 17, he convinced people he was a graduate of the American Airlines pilot school, with only a uniform he picked up from a store. He had also managed to open multiple bank accounts under different names, and had forged his driving license to make him 10 years older on paper. So it wasn't that difficult for him to convince all the prison guards that he was an authority figure simply by his demeanor, which the guards could differentiate from other inmates. The guards wanted to keep Frank happy, so he would be lenient with his review and wouldn't get the guards in trouble. That's when they started to comply with every request Frank made. The foundation was ready. Frank was given a wide berth by the prison administration, and all the perks that other inmates would have to fight for were given to him very, very easily. Calling up his friend? Sure, why not? This is where his friend, Jean Sebring, stepped into the picture. Jean had a business card that an FBI agent, Joe Shea, had given to her. She used this card to create a new one on which she entered Frank's information. She then impersonated a journalist and told the prison guards that she was writing an article about the prison and she wanted to interview Frank for better insight for the piece. One call and one visit from Jean later, Frank had in his hand the ticket to his freedom, a forged FBI card. Isn't it a great feeling when our intellect is validated? When something you suspected turns out to be right? That's exactly how the guards felt when Frank, the undercover investigator, waved his ID in front of their faces. Of course he was spying on them. They were onto him from the start. They were no fools, or at least so they thought. On the pretext of stepping outside to meet his associate, Frank Abagnale, the master con man, was finally in the wind, once again. To better understand the sheer audacity of this escape, you must know that this prison in Atlanta was no ordinary prison. It was a high-security prison which had a legacy behind it. It had housed Al Capone, one of the most dangerous career criminals in the history of the world, who had only managed to escape Alcatraz, a maximum security prison, considered to be impossible to escape with the help of his network of cronies. And Mr. Abagnale required nothing more than a stroll. This wasn't the first time Frank had escaped prison either. He once slipped through the cracks of Cobb County Jail during a work detail, which in the U.S. is the name for the paid job that every prisoner must do. But Frank had to face the consequences that eventually came knocking at his door because of the road he paved for himself. Just a couple months after confidently walking out of the federal detention center in Atlanta, he was apprehended and went on to serve 4 years in prison. So was this the end of the road for Frank? Did the Great Escape only last a couple months? Again, life became very difficult for Frank after prison. At first, he worked a lot of odd jobs. He took on multiple job opportunities and worked as a grocer, a cook, and a movie projectionist. But the sad truth is that society doesn't believe in giving convicted felons a second chance. So every time Frank tried to hold down a job, he was fired the moment his criminal past came to light. Defeated, Frank fell back into his criminal ways of impersonating a pilot with a master's degree. But his identity got discovered quickly, and he was penalized before he could execute his plan. Life truly changed for him when his criminal past turned into a handy tool for the law enforcement system. His prison time was cut down when he offered his services as a consultant for the FBI. He went on to turn his past life as a criminal to an asset as he went on to start his own private financial fraud consultancy firm named Abagnale and Associates. That Steven Spielberg movie mentioned earlier in the video, it was based off Frank's own life and written off his autobiographical book of the same name, Catch Me If You Can. The life he built for himself after his career in crime is truly remarkable. Not many would have given a convicted criminal a second chance at life, so he built it from the ground up himself. Later in life, the same FBI agent whose identity Frank stole to escape prison, the person who first arrested Frank, Agent John Shea, went on to become a close friend of Frank's when Frank began working with the FBI. Shea once said about Frank, he was not a violent type of criminal. No guns, no knives, never hurt anybody. That wasn't his style. He used his brains and his bravado to pass himself off as what he was impersonating. The character styled after John Shea in Catch Me If You Can was played by the legendary Tom Hanks. As for the Atlanta prison, it unfortunately lost its reputation as an infamous maximum security prison, and it continues to be broken out of to this day. Once a high security prison, the prison was later turned into a medium security prison, and today, with a dire lack of amenities and proper security, has become a low security prison. Not only does the prison pose the threat of more inmates possibly escaping, it also fails to provide for the basic needs of not just the prisoners, but also the security personnel working there. While Frank continues to do well for himself and helps the government bring fraudsters to justice, the prison system meant to hold these criminals continues to deteriorate. Perhaps if Frank had to escape today, he wouldn't have to work too hard after all. As the sun set on a summer evening in upstate New York, an eerie silence fell over Clinton Correction Facility. A maximum security prison nestled in the small town of Dannemora was known for housing some of the most dangerous criminals in the state. But on this night, something was different. The guards patrolling the prison walls had no idea that two of their most notorious inmates were plotting their escape. Richard Matt and David Sweat, both serving life sentences for murder, had been digging their way out of their cells for months. And as the darkness descended upon the prison, they were ready to make their move. Richard Matt was a career criminal who had spent most of his adult life in and out of prison. He was born in Tonawanda, New York in 1966 and had a troubled childhood. He turned to a life of crime at an early age, and by the time he was in his 20s, he had been convicted of several crimes, including kidnapping, assault, and robbery. In 1997, Matt was sentenced to 25 years in prison for the kidnapping and murder of a businessman. He was transferred to the Clinton Correction Facility in 2008, where he was serving a sentence. David Sweat, on the other hand, was a convicted killer who was serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He was sentenced to life in prison in 2003 for the murder of a sheriff's deputy. The escape of Richard Matt and David Sweat from the Clinton Correctional Facility in 2015 was a carefully planned and executed effort that lasted several months. In planning their escape, Richard Matt and David Sweat considered several factors, including the prison's layout, the location of the guards, and the routines of the prison staff. They had studied the prison's security measures and were aware of its weaknesses, which they exploited to their advantage. The two convicts worked on their escape at night, when the prison was quieter and less active. They used soundproof walls and coverings to muffle the noise of their drilling and sawing. They also had to be careful to avoid detection by the guards and cameras, which required precise timing and coordination. Their first step was to gain access to the prison's maintenance tunnels, which they accomplished by cutting through their cell walls with power tools. Once they were in the tunnels, they made their way through the maze of pipes and vents until they reached a manhole that led to the outside of the prison walls. To get through the manhole, Matt and Sweat used hacksaws and other cutting tools to break through the metal grates that covered it. They then crawled through the small opening and emerged outside the prison walls. From there, the two inmates made their way to a nearby train station, where they had stashed a car that they had stolen from a prison employee. They then drove the car to a nearby town where they split up and went their separate ways. The escape was discovered on the morning of June 6, 2015, when prison guards did a head count of all the inmates during the morning roll call. When they got to the cells of Richard Matt and David Sweat, they found that they were empty. At first, the guards assumed that the two men might have been transferred to another facility, or that they were in the infirmary. But a further investigation revealed that they were nowhere to be found. A search of the prison grounds was immediately initiated, and it was soon discovered that the two men had cut their way through the back of their cells and into a series of tunnels and pipes that led to a manhole outside the prison walls. The manhole cover had been lifted, indicating that they had escaped through it. It quickly became clear that the two men had planned their escape meticulously and had taken great care to cover their tracks. However, they made one critical error. They failed to cover up the manhole after they had emerged from it, which made it easy for authorities to discover how they had escaped. After their escape, Richard Matt and David Sweat left a sarcastic note for the prison guards that included a happy face and read, "Have a nice day." The note was found near the pipe that the two men had used to break out of the prison, and it added insult to injury for the prison staff who were already reeling from the audacious escape. The note hinted at the brazen confidence of the escapees and the extent of the planning that went into their escape. The discovery of the empty cells and the manhole led to a massive manhunt that lasted for 3 weeks and involved hundreds of law enforcement officers from multiple agencies, including the New York State Police, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the U.S. Marshals Service. Helicopters and canine units were used. The search covered a large area of upstate New York and parts of Vermont and Canada. The authorities also offered a $100,000 reward for information leading to the capture of the fugitives. After the escape, Richard Matt and David Sweat spent several weeks in the surrounding areas of the prison, attempting to evade the authorities. They stole food, clothing, and camping gear from local hunting cabins and continued their journey deeper into the wilderness. At one point, they were spotted by a passing motorist, but the witness did not recognize the escapees and did not report the sighting until days later. Matt and Sweat also broke into a number of vacation homes and seasonal camps, stealing supplies and leaving behind clues to their whereabouts. Despite the extensive manhunt that was underway, the two men managed to elude the authorities for over 3 weeks, traveling almost 25 miles through the dense Adirondack forest. They made their way to a remote area near the Canadian border, where they were eventually tracked down by a team of U.S. Marshals. The men were located in a makeshift campsite, surrounded by discarded food wrappers and other evidence that they had been living in the area. The manhunt came to an end on June 26, when a U.S. Customs and Border Protection tactical team spotted Richard Matt in the woods near the Canadian border. He was shot and killed by a U.S. Border Patrol agent after he refused to surrender. David Sweat was captured 2 days later near the town of Constable, New York, after being spotted by a New York State trooper. He was shot and captured after he refused to surrender and fled from the trooper. The investigation into the prison break revealed a shocking level of complicity and corruption within the Clinton Correctional Facility. It was discovered that the two men had received assistance from a prison employee named Joyce Mitchell, who had agreed to be their getaway driver after their escape. Mitchell, who was a supervisor in the prison's tailor shop, had become close to the two men and had helped them obtain tools and other materials that they used in their escape. She later changed her mind about being their getaway driver and failed to show up at the agreed-upon location. Mitchell was charged with facilitating the escape and was sentenced to up to 7 years in prison. The investigation also revealed that the two men had used power tools to cut through the walls of their cells and the pipes in the tunnels. The tools were believed to have been supplied by Mitchell and another prison employee named Gene Palmer. Palmer, who was a corrections officer, had been suspended and later resigned from his job. He was charged with promoting prison contraband and tampering with physical evidence. The New York prison escape of Richard Matt and David Sweat was a major embarrassment for the state and sparked calls for reform and improvements in the state's prison system. The incident highlighted the need for increased security measures and better employee screening procedures, as well as the need for better training and support for prison staff. After the escape of Richard Matt and David Sweat, the Clinton Correctional Facility made several security adjustments, including installing new cameras and creating an escape-proof cell block. They also hired additional staff, including guards and security personnel, to increase security presence. These measures were implemented to prevent future escapes and ensure the safety of everyone within the prison. In conclusion, the New York prison escape of Richard Matt and David Sweat was a major event that captured the nation's attention and raised serious questions about the security and management of the state's prisons. The escape was the result of a combination of factors, including a lack of proper security measures, corruption and complicity among the prison employees, and the cunning and determination of the two convicted murderers. The manhunt that followed was a testament to the dedication and determination of law enforcement officers from multiple agencies, who worked tirelessly to bring the fugitives to justice. It was May 12, 2022, and a Texas Department of Criminal Justice bus was making its way from the Alfred D. Hugh Unit in Gatesville, Texas, toward a medical appointment in Huntsville. The ride was going to be 3 hours long. The morning was serene as it could be for 16 prisoners and 2 veteran prison officers, one which was driving the bus, all sharing the same enclosed space. Then, one of the men, a heavily tattooed Mexican prisoner named Gonzalo Lopez, started talking. His words were addressed to Michael Wages, the inmate behind Lopez. His words were bold, and in retrospect, taunting. But only a few minutes later, Lopez's intentions became somewhat clearer, at least to Wages, who was the only one really paying attention to the man. As for the guards, they were either lost in conversation or too uninterested to notice. But it happened all the same. With a few concealed and quick movements, Gonzalo Lopez slipped out of his handcuffs. Then he removed his leg irons. His movements were natural and carefree. He had planned this for a long while. The man had spent the last couple of months, weeks, and days fashioning or somehow acquiring a key. He'd known that, when the time came, he would use this key to discard his handcuffs. And on the morning of May 12, 2022, just before he was taken on the bus, he made sure to slip the key inside his mouth. A few minutes after freeing himself from the handcuffs and leg irons, Lopez produced 2 8 to 10 inch metal weapons from his pockets. Michael Wages, who was sitting right behind Gonzalo Lopez, was the only one to notice the blades. He was terrified, but what scared him more was the look in Lopez's eyes. Wages knew straight away the man was a killer, and that Lopez wouldn't let anything or anyone destroy whatever plan he'd hatched. Despite this, Lopez gave him a quick reassurance that he wasn't going to kill him. Still terrified and fearing for his life, Wages chose to keep his mouth shut and not alert the prison officers. Wages' assessment was, in fact, correct. Gonzalo Lopez was a killer with a long history of violence. His criminal history dates back to 1994, when an 18-year-old Lopez was convicted of aggravated assault, possession of marijuana, failure to stop and render aid, and unauthorized use of a motor vehicle. In 1996, he was sentenced to 8 years in prison for all these charges. In 2004, the man was involved in a high-speed police chase. After firing shots at the police, Lopez escaped by fleeing on foot. But his most gruesome crime yet, the one he was currently in prison for, was the 2005 kidnapping and murder of Jose Guadalupe Ramirez. In 2005, Gonzalo Lopez was part of the La Mana drug cartel based in Tamaulipas, Mexico. Ramirez owed the cartel $40,000, and he had to pay it back one way or another. Lopez killed Ramirez with a pickaxe before burying his body in the woods. Lopez was arrested a month later, in April 2005, and he was sentenced to life in prison for capital murder and aggravated kidnapping. Gonzalo Lopez wasn't someone to be messed with. He was as resourceful as he was gruesome. In the months before May 12, 2022, the man went on many medical trips, not because he had any serious health issues, but because he wanted to get familiar with the prison buses and the security protocols. These trips helped him make some important discoveries. First, the number of guards present on these trips was way smaller than expected. Almost half of the prison guard jobs at the Hughes unit were vacant. Because of this, the remaining guards were overworked, which made them grow increasingly lax. Lopez had noticed this laxity and used it to his advantage. That's how he knew making a key for the handcuffs and obtaining the blades would be safe. He knew the guards wouldn't bother to use the body orifice security scanner or boss chair on him. If the guards had used the device, they would have surely noticed the metallic pieces hidden in Lopez's mouth, but they failed to do so. They didn't even give him a quick pat-down. After he freed himself, Gonzalo Lopez opened all of the windows he could reach inside the caged area at the front of the bus, which was reserved for high-security prisoners. Then, over the next hour, Lopez started prying up the tack welds around the square of the metal grating between the high-security prisoners and the driver. Had there been a third officer inside the bus, Lopez might have been spotted and stopped, but as such, he was free to do as he pleased. It certainly helped that the other prisoners were rooting for him. Once they realized what the man was doing, 2 of them started rapping rather loudly. They wanted to help him. It was around midday and the bus was now approaching the tiny town of Centerville, located halfway between Houston and Dallas. An hour and a half into the trip, Gonzalo Lopez managed to pry off a 9-inch by 18-inch square of grating. The escape was on. In an instant, Lopez stabbed the driver with one of the shanks. The bus came to an abrupt stop on Highway 7, and the 2 men stumbled outside fighting. But Lopez had the upper hand. He managed to snatch the driver's gun holster, but he didn't have time to figure out how to remove the weapon. Suddenly, the other officer burst out of the bus, gun in hand. The driver begged him to shoot Lopez, but Lopez was quicker. With both officers now outside, Lopez scrambled back up into the bus and began driving away. The officers started shooting, but they couldn't hit Lopez. Instead, they managed to hit one of the rear tires. Still, Lopez drove away a couple of miles down Highway 7 near Centerville. Then he crashed the bus into a ditch, but he wasn't about to get caught. Instead, he dove out of a window and took off, leaving the other prisoners fearing for their lives. A nearby police officer in a patrol car was alerted by an onlooker. But even though he was the first on the scene when the bus crashed, he saw Lopez running away. The officer failed to chase after the inmate or shoot at him. For more than an hour after Lopez got free, the guards couldn't figure out who had escaped. They thought it had been Wages, but as we know, Wages was still on the bus. As soon as Lopez was identified as the escapee, the manhunt was on. The Lone Star Fugitive Task Force, the Texas Rangers, and the U.S. Marshals all showed up to aid in the search. But hundreds of people, helicopters fitted with thermal imaging, and tracking dogs weren't enough to find the man. For 3 weeks, nobody had any idea where Lopez was. Well, at least not officially. By late May, authorities and locals alike were more or less convinced Gonzalo Lopez had already fled the area, and that searching for him was futile. But on May 31st, authorities got an interesting call about a breaking and entering on Highway 7 in Centerville. They discovered evidence that Lopez was to blame. The thief had stolen food, soda, a jacket, and bottled water, in addition to taking a shower with rainwater. Investigators examined a nearby vacation property owned by one Collins family after gathering forensic evidence to compare with the DNA of the escapee. Yet nobody informed the people that Gonzalo Lopez might still be nearby. As such, people relaxed. They thought they were safe. They thought the monster was gone. He was only getting ready to strike in a bloody, grotesque, and inhuman manner. On June 2, 2022, Gonzalo Lopez broke into a ranch owned by the Collins family in Centerville, Texas. Inside, he found 66-year-old Mark Collins and his 4 grandchildren, 8-year-old Waylon Collins, 16-year-old Carson Collins, and 11-year-old Hudson Collins. 11-year-old Bryson Collins was their cousin. Gonzalo Lopez killed them all, either by shooting or by stabbing them. After murdering the 5 members of the Collins family, Lopez stole several guns from the ranch, including an AR-15. Then he took off in the family's white pickup. The Leon County Sheriff's Office discovered that Lopez's DNA matched the burglary's DNA on June 2nd, only 2 days later. 20 minutes later, the Sheriff's Office fielded a call from Chris Collins, who said he was worried about his 3 sons and their cousin. Law enforcement officers headed to the Collins Ranch. They found the bodies inside. The white pickup had been seen heading south from San Antonio. Spike strips were laid across the highway. Lopez drove over, puncturing all his tires, but he didn't stop driving. Once he entered the city limits of Jordanton, Lopez shot at the police through the truck's window. Then he lost control of the truck, crashed into a utility pole, and finally crashed into a fence. But the fight hadn't left him. He got out of the truck and started shooting at officers. He was killed in the shootout. 7 months after Gonzalo Lopez, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice released a report showing the multiple failures that led to Lopez's escape. The report concluded the escape could have been prevented. Maybe then, Mark Collins and his 4 grandchildren would still be alive. Imagine being locked away in a prison notorious for its inescapable design, surrounded by treacherous waters and armed guards at every turn. The very thought of breaking free from Alcatraz Island seems like a pipe dream. But what if I told you that some brave souls dared to challenge the odds and attempt the impossible? This is the tale of a group of prisoners who refused to surrender to their fate and instead banded together to plot an escape unlike any other. It's a story of cunning, bravery, and determination, where every move is a risk, every decision is crucial, and every moment is a race against time. This is the story of Frank Morris, John Anglin, and his brother Clarence, who accomplished the unthinkable. A cryptic correspondence has emerged lately, believed to be from one of the three notorious prisoners who fled the infamous Alcatraz prison in 1962. The letter, purporting to be from John Anglin, was reportedly sent to the San Francisco police in 2013, but only recently came to light, adding to the mystery surrounding the daring escape. "My name is John Anglin," reads the letter. "I escaped Alcatraz in June 1962. Yes, we all made it out that night, but barely." Nestled in the heart of San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz Island was once home to one of the world's most secure prisons. Dubbed the Rock, this formidable fortress held some of the most dangerous criminals of its time, including notorious figures like Al Capone and George Machine Gun Kelly. But it wasn't just its notorious residents that made Alcatraz stand out. It was also its rich history, dating back to its use as a military prison during the Civil War. That added to its reputation as an impenetrable fortress. From its steel bars to the treacherous waters that surrounded it, Alcatraz was designed to keep even the most daring escape artist locked away. Yet, despite its reputation, a select few were not deterred and attempted to break free, including Frank Morris, John Anglin, and his brother Clarence. Frank Morris was a man shrouded in mystery. With a reputation for being one of the most cunning and determined criminals of his time, he arrived at Alcatraz in January 1960 after a string of convictions for bank robbery, burglary, and other crimes. Despite being housed in the world's most secure prison, Morris was not one to be contained easily. He had a history of attempted escapes from various prisons, showcasing his unwavering determination to break free. Upon his arrival at Alcatraz, Morris was introduced to John Anglin, a fellow convict with a similar thirst for freedom. The two quickly became friends, and soon after, John's brother Clarence arrived at the prison, completing the trio of determined escape artists. The Anglin brothers had a troubled upbringing, growing up as part of a family of seasonal workers who struggled to make ends meet. This poverty pushed the brothers towards a life of crime at a young age, with their first known offense being a break-in at a service station at just 14 years old. The brothers quickly escalated their criminal activities, eventually getting caught for robbing the Columbia Savings Bank in Columbia, Alabama, and being sentenced to 35 years in prison. After multiple failed escape attempts from the Atlanta penitentiary, they were eventually transferred to the notoriously secure Alcatraz in 1960. The final member of the escape group was Allen West. Before being sentenced to prison for auto theft in 1955, serial criminal Allen had already been detained more than 20 times. After being sent from Atlanta Penitentiary to Florida State Prison, he made an attempt at escape and was captured, ending up in Alcatraz in 1957. Together, the four men formed an unbreakable bond and began to hatch a plan that would go down in history as the greatest prison escape ever attempted. On June 12, 1962, it was just another routine day at Alcatraz, until a guard making his morning rounds discovered a shocking sight. As he approached cell block D, he noticed something peculiar about the three cells he was assigned to check. The prisoners inside, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, were nowhere to be seen. Instead, the guard was met with three dummy heads made of paper mache and hair that were meant to fool the guards into thinking the prisoners were still in their cells. Alarmed by this discovery, the guard quickly raised the alarm, sending shockwaves through the prison. The warden in charge, realizing the magnitude of the situation, immediately notified state and federal authorities, as well as the U.S. military. An intensive manhunt was launched as authorities scrambled to find the missing prisoners and bring them to justice. As the manhunt began, the authorities were met with a mystery that would leave them scratching their heads for years to come. In the cells of the missing men, the guards found evidence of a meticulous plan. The FBI, the Coast Guard, and the Bureau of Prison Authorities worked tirelessly to uncover the truth behind the daring plan. As they pieced together the evidence, a picture started to emerge of the sheer determination and ingenuity of the three convicts, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence. The preparations for the escape had begun the previous December when one of the convicts stumbled upon some old saw blades. Utilizing crude tools, including a drill fashioned from a vacuum cleaner motor, they gradually widened the holes around the ventilation ducts under the sinks in their cells, hiding their progress with painted pieces of cardboard. During music hour, Morris would play his accordion to mask the sounds of their drilling, using the time set aside each day for calming the prisoners down with music. Once they were able to fit through the holes, the men set up a secret workshop in the top level of their cell block. With the help of stolen and donated raincoats, they constructed a raft and life jackets, carefully stitching and sealing the rubber on the hot pipes in their workshop. The raft and jackets would be crucial to their escape plan, which was carefully crafted down to the smallest detail. The escapees were smart and resourceful, crafting realistic decoys of themselves in order to keep their nighttime workshop hidden. They created the decoys out of a combination of soap dust, toilet paper, and toothpaste, molding them into the shape of their heads. Then they added finishing touches like paint from the maintenance workshop and real human hair from the barbershop, giving the decoys a lifelike appearance. During their workshop hours, these decoys were placed on their pillows, while their beds were made to look occupied with clothes and towels stuffed under their blankets. This clever ruse allowed the men to work uninterrupted on their escape plan. Their next challenge was getting out of the building itself. The ceiling was a daunting 30 feet high, but with determination and resourcefulness, the convicts used a network of pipes to climb up and eventually pried open the ventilator at the top of the shaft. They kept it in place with a fake bolt made from soap, but the rest of their escape remained a mystery. The truth behind their risky scheme is still one of the greatest questions in American history. The fate of Morris and the Anglins is still unknown, despite numerous investigations and searches over the years. While their daring escape from the notorious Alcatraz island was the talk of the town, no one could say for sure whether they actually made it to the mainland. The evidence was fragmented, with only remnants of their makeshift raft found near Angel Island. The official version was that they had drowned in the treacherous waters of San Francisco Bay, while others whispered that they had made it to the mainland, disappeared into the night, and started a new life under assumed identities. Despite extensive searches and investigations, no trace of the fugitives was ever found, leaving the authorities and the public in a state of uncertainty and disbelief. Some say that the men were aided by underworld connections or sympathetic sympathizers who provided them with food, money, and shelter. Others believe that they perished in the freezing water, unable to overcome the powerful currents and rough waves. West, who stayed behind, revealed the men's plan to reach Angel Island, swim to the mainland, and steal new clothes from a store. But despite this, no crime of this nature was reported. The authorities searched high and low, but no bodies were found in the bay, leaving people to wonder if the escapees had perished in the strong currents of the water. The disappearance of the three men was a true enigma, causing people to imagine the worst. Their families were left with nothing but questions, and their fate was left forever uncertain.